This morning we're going to begin a new series of lessons, the subject of which is technology. The title of the series, at least the working title, is What Does Silicon Valley Have to Do with Jerusalem? Which is sort of a spin-off of the 2nd century church father Tertullian's famous question of what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? And what he meant by that is, what does philosophy have to do with Christianity? And so our question essentially is, what does technology have to do with Christianity? And its purpose is to develop, or at least to gesture in the direction of developing a distinctive Christian view, or a distinctly Christian view of technology. An attempt to understand technology in light of the biblical story. Our text for this morning is Proverbs 14, verse 15, which reads, "The naive believes everything, but the sensible person considers his steps." In Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus, we find what is perhaps the earliest critique of technology. A criticism which may seem absurd at first, for the innovation of which the Athenian philosopher is skeptical is literature itself, in other words, the written word. Which means, as many people have pointed out, that Plato's critique, a written dialogue, relies upon the very technology that it's criticizing, which is an odd state of affairs, to be sure. But it's not one, I don't think, without good explanation, once the context of Plato's writing is considered. Plato lived in the twilight of what was essentially an oral culture, meaning that spoken modes of communication were the primary media through which the mythos and logos of the age would be passed down. As the Bard entertained the masses with the primeval history of Greece through the performing of Homeric poetry, and the politician persuaded the demos, the voting class, of the fitness of his public policies through reasoned discourse. And the philosopher provoked his students to good contemplation through the dialogos, or through dialogue. However, due to economic and political instability that was created in part by the Peloponnesian War, a cultural shift began to take place in 5th century Athens, where traditional voices of cultural expression and formation were being upstaged by a relatively new technology, what some have called a literate revolution, meaning not just the producing of a written record of valuable cultural artifacts for the sake of posterity. In other words, it wasn't just the writing down of the Iliad so that its content could be preserved. That was a well-established practice at this time. But rather it was the creation of new cultural expressions through this novel medium of the written word. Which is to say, what was being created were things like written poetry that was meant to be read privately, or didactic treatises that were never intended for public utterance. And accompanying this technological innovation were lofty promises of not only the potential for limitless memory, but the proliferation of wisdom to the ends of the earth. Through written text, the cultural feast, which is Athens, could be delivered to the world, rather than the world having to come to Athens to partake of it. So Plato's life was lived in the midst of this radical technological transition, residing, as he did, we might say, in the gray zone, the overlap of eras, just as we find ourselves today. And he was suspicious of this new medium, even as he used it to give expression to that skepticism. Now, the passage which perhaps best encapsulates Plato's concerns is near the end of the dialogue, where Socrates, his main character, his mouthpiece, recounts an ancient Egyptian creation story about the origins of writing. In the myth, the Egyptian god Tooth pays a visit to King Thamus, hoping that the wise ruler will agree to disseminate several of his technical innovations throughout Egypt, including writing. The passage goes like this. But when it came to writing, Tooth said, "Here, O king, is a branch of learning that will make the people of Egypt wiser and improve their memories. My discovery provides an elixir for memory and wisdom." But the king answered and said, "O man full of arts, to one it is given to create the things of art, and to another to judge what measure of harm or of profit they have for those that shall employ them. And so it is that you, by reasons of your tender regard for the writing that is your offspring, have declared the very opposite of its true effect. If men learn this, it will impart forgetfulness in their souls. They will cease to exercise memory because they rely on that which is written, calling things to remembrance no longer from within themselves, but by means of external marks. What you have discovered is an elixir not for memory, but for reminder. And it is no true wisdom that you offer your disciples, but only its semblance. For by telling them of many things without teaching them, you will make them seem to know much, while for the most part they know nothing. And as men filled not with wisdom, but with the conceit of wisdom, they will be a burden to their fellows. There's so much wisdom for our present moment in this passage, it's hard to limit myself to our current discussion. But the first thing to acknowledge is that because our world has been so shaped by written texts, it's almost impossible for us to fully grasp Plato's meta-critique here. And so to help red pill us, as they say, or if we want to use Plato's metaphor, to free us from the cave, which is to say to make us aware of the cultural impact of literature, so that we might see the frame of the window through which we observe the world, the literary frame. Consider for a moment the fact that up until very recently, the majority of our institutions were constructed around, and we might even say all of them, were constructed around the written word, a fact which once it's spoken becomes immediately obvious. Our government and legal system is grounded, of course, in what? The Constitution, a written text. The church itself, particularly the Protestant church, is defined by what? Not by the institutional church, but by Scripture alone, sola scriptura. Our educational system was constructed around what kind of learning? The learning of texts. The liberal arts are in the interpretive arts, the art of interpreting great texts, all of which seems intuitive to us today, but would have been peculiar to an ancient Hellenist. So what then is Plato's critique exactly of the written word? Well, the first part of it is fairly straightforward. Tooth promises that writing will improve memory, because the ability to write things down means that you will never forget them. But Plato, through Themus, rightly observes that the opposite will actually be the case, that because man will no longer rely on his mind to remember most things, his capacity for memory will decrease significantly. Therefore, what Tooth actually has discovered is an elixir for reminder, says Plato, not memory, which is of value, certainly. There's value in such a reminder, but it's not a value which comes cheap, according to Plato. For it comes at the cost of a dramatic reduction in our ability to remember, which tells us a principle that there's always a trade-off when it comes to technology, when it comes to a new tool, when it is implemented. And the invention, I think, of the internet and the smartphone, which makes us dumb, has only increased the cost of this. For why bother memorizing anything today when everything anyone would ever want to know is just a tap away? As Doug Wilson has smartly said, having a smartphone is the equivalent of having 1,000 servants 100 years ago, and Google is your butler, which is making us very lazy in terms of our memory. As a result, people today struggle to remember even a 7-digit phone number. While according to scholars, ancient Celtic bards could memorize thousands of songs and stories and chants and poems that could take hours to recite in full. A practice still conducted by Aborigines today. We like to think about how primitive Aborigines are, and in many ways they are primitive, no doubt, but their memory is incredible compared to ours. I can't even remember my wife's phone number. I'm not sure I ever knew it. Right? Which it wasn't that long ago. That would have been very strange. That would be a sign of trouble. But you know, you go to a restaurant, you get served by a waiter, and the waiter doesn't write down your order. He does it by memory, and we are amazed by that. So here's a little experiment. The next time you head to the grocery store, and I know you have your groceries delivered. We're going to get back to that idea in a moment. But don't text yourself the list, right? Don't write down or put it on your cell phone. Memorize it instead, the whole list. The question is, do you think you could do it? The doubt you are experiencing is a sign of your dependence upon technology, upon the written word, and now the digital word. Interestingly, during periods of church persecution, when manuscripts were being burned and Christians were not allowed to assemble, brethren took to memorizing entire books of the Bible. Not a few verses or even a chapter, entire books like the Gospel of Luke. They would store up God's word in their hearts so that they would always have it, which I think is a practice that we should keep not just in times of persecution, because our relationship to God's text changes when we memorize it. When it is no longer text, in other words, but becomes truth that's stored in our hearts, so that the memory of all that God has done and all that he has promised to do will be at the forefront of our minds. Because as we've said, a failure to remember is the beginning of what eventually ends in demonic servitude. And I also think, given the time we are living in now, in the sense that it seems quite likely that we're going to face persecution, it's time now to start engaging in these spiritual disciplines, in preparing for persecution by memorizing these texts of Scripture. In fact, I think it's absolutely vital that we begin to do so. In addition to undermining our capacity for memory, Plato also worries that the written word will prevent us from gaining knowledge. And this is due to what he assumes will be the death of discourse. Plato here is thinking of the written word as the sole instructor. And in such a role, texts are obviously quite limited. First of all, they're kind of like a painting. What a text signifies is all that it will ever signify, for it is incapable of adding, clarifying, or even retracting what it has said. It has no self-awareness, we might say, and therefore no questions can be asked of it. Or you can ask the questions, but you will get back no answer. And I'm sure we have all had the experience of reading a text and being frustrated by the author who fails to answer the questions that the text elicits. In addition, a written text shows no discretion concerning its reader. It proclaims the same message to fool and sage alike, meaning that there is much less responsibility on the writer as to what his pupils believe compared to a teacher in the academy. All of this, argues Plato, will allow men to think, because they've merely read the text, that they have understood it, when in fact they have not. And if you doubt Plato on this, all you have to do is just join any book club, and you will quickly see that it's the case. Okay, so I take that back slightly. I think Plato would actually like book clubs to some extent if they're well run, because at least they're engaging in dialogos, right? At least they're engaging in dialogue. I could have, thrown shade on any honors college and any Christian university where they have a tendency to teach students that by merely reading these great texts, that's the equivalent to them mastering those two texts, and those are two significantly different things. But overall, Plato's fear here is that the mass proliferation of information without a wise teacher to ensure its understanding will lead to a society full of the most deplorable of men, those bereft of wisdom's substance, but not its conceit, which in turn will place a heavy burden on society as a whole. Now, does that sound familiar to anyone else? The mass proliferation of information accompanied by a complete lack of discernment for turning that information into knowledge. By the way, the last time that happened in history, we had 100 years of war. All of this to say that Plato realizes that something profound is taking place with the advent of this new technology. As philosopher D.C. Schindler elucidates it, Plato recognizes that this new technology is not just an additional tool to add to the general store in pursuit of the various ends of human existence, but in fact is profoundly revolutionary in the sense that it introduces a new culture, a new medium through which all various ends of human existence will be perceived and understood. Writing is not simply a tool that was developed to perform a particular task, which is how technological advancements are often thought of by those who are naive. No, the innovation of writing, if adopted, would mean sweeping changes to the way human beings see the world. This is why Plato is not so much concerned with what people will write, although that certainly is important. But in this case, he's much more concerned rather with that people will write, not what they will write, but that they will write. And this is because formative technologies have what Neil Postman calls an ideological bias, meaning, in his words, a predisposition to construct the world as one thing rather than another, to value one thing over another, to amplify one sense or skill or attitude more loudly than another. Major technological innovation is not neutral, in other words. It's value-laden. It chooses, by its form, one particular construct of the world over others. The tool, in other words, becomes the lens through which we understand the cosmos. And in radical technologies, it becomes often the only tool, the only lens by which we see the world. Postman provides a brilliant illustration of how this works in his book Technopoly. The example is the educational innovation of assigning numerical grades. Instead of just having a pass or fail to the class, it's the technology, and we often wouldn't think of this as a technology, but it is. It's the technology of using a letter or number grade as a tool of assessment. Again, this is a practice which is so natural to us that we can hardly conceive of an educational system in which it wouldn't exist. In order to see how deeply embedded it is, I ask you to try suggesting to a professional educator sometime that students would be better served if we got rid of the grading system and see what kind of response you would get. The incredulity directed your way would be pointed, because the suggestion seems patently absurd to most people, because they cannot imagine educational assessment in any other way. Numeric grading, in other words, is part of our social imaginary. And yet, assigning a quantitative value to a human thought was up until fairly recently quite peculiar. Indeed, the first instance of it was at Cambridge University, near the end of the 18th century. But soon it was universally adopted, and so we're talking about sweeping technological change here. The result of which, as many people have noted, was a major step toward the construction of a mathematical conception of reality, of understanding the world, in other words, through numbers. While it may seem perfectly normal to us, the idea of a man's intelligence being quantified as 124 on an IQ test, or that one paper deserves a 98 while another deserves a 72, would have been total nonsense to people like Martin Luther or William Shakespeare, or even as recent as John Adams. And not because they lacked discernment when it came to judging the quality of writing, hardly. Their judgment far surpasses our own. No, what would be foreign to them is the idea of quantifying that quality numerically. That would have seemed very odd to them. It's natural for us, because our minds have been conditioned by technology, by the technology of numbers, to see the world differently, to conceive of the world differently than they did, to conceive of the world as numerically quantifiable, which isn't entirely wrong, of course, because it's certainly one legitimate way to conceptualize the cosmos. And for certain tasks, like engineering, it has proven quite beneficial. But it offers only a thin slice of reality. And when, at the peak of modernity, we expanded this conception to encompass everything, it closed man off from deeper understandings of reality, the ones, in fact, which make the world worth inhabiting. By turning the world into nothing more than mathematical calculations, in other words, we disenchanted it. But a one-dimensional view of reality is often what follows in the wake of a major technological innovation. Postman notes this tendency by appealing to a familiar aphorism that to a man with a new hammer, right, everything looks like a nail. He expands it to say to a man with a new pencil, everything looks like a list. To a man with a new camera, everything looks like an image. To a man with a new computer, everything looks like data, and on and on. And the experience of most following that transition to cultural myopathy, cultural short-sightedness or narrow-sightedness, is happy delusion, not skepticism. It's like being plugged into the matrix, it seems, where people are so immersed in the practical application of this technology and in the excitement of its potential that they are blinded to what's going on at the meta level. Thus, most spend their time wondering how they can take advantage of this new technology instead of considering what has changed with its implementation and whether it should have been implemented in the first place. And this is even true of those whose job it is to think on the meta level. Social critic Evgeny Morozov gives a contemporary example of this when he writes, "What lawyers and philosophers, and we could add preachers, often want to talk about is basically how to build an algorithm that is ethical, without questioning where and when you should build algorithms and where and when you shouldn't build them. I think algorithms, as envisioned by lawyers and philosophers and preachers, is a very comfortable discursive frame. Don't ask questions about whether you should implement them in the first place, like surveillance algorithms. Just talk about how to make them ethical." The purpose of this sermon, in part, is to disrupt that frame. By the way, the people running Facebook do not share our naivete when it comes to technology. They know exactly what's going on. They live at the meta level, for they are building the metaverse, a place to experience reality beyond our current capacity, a new lens through which to see the world. And it is quite a fantastic lens, a kaleidoscope, we might call it. Which is to say that meaning, or I should say it this way, meaning that our world is going to be re-enchanted. Right? We are in the twilight of modernity that disenchanted our world, and people cannot live in that kind of world. And so it is going to be re-enchanted one way or another. What do you think the whole woke religion is about? It's a poor attempt at re-enchanting the world, but wokeism has nothing to offer compared to these tech giants. There's no doubt that our world will be re-enchanted. Mark Zuckerberg's plan is to do so through virtual reality, or what he calls MR, mixed reality, a kind of double-souled existence that is both physical and virtual, an augmented reality. And in doing so, he is, of course, plagiarizing the great Christian mythos, this combining of heaven and earth, the hyper-physicality that is to come at the eschaton, at the end of the age. But not to be upstaged, Jack Dorsey, who is the founder of Twitter, has his own idealistic vision of the future, and he calls this Web 3. Now already you start to sense that Dorsey seems to lack Zuckerberg's ability to cast a vision, that Zuck, is a much better preacher than Jack is, and that means he will probably be more successful. And it's not just a lens that they are giving us, it's an entirely new gospel. Which is to say, what undergirds this technology is a particular vision of the good life, a meaning-making story of technological progress, of a utopian society, of a singularity which explains the entire universe. What some call technical solutionism, or others technicism, a view of technology as the savior of the human condition. To save the world, click here kind of mentality, a tech religion. These technological geniuses, in other words, are engaged in myth-making, proclaiming the good news that they will soon re-enchant our world. Therefore, their innovations will not just dictate our conceptual framework, the narrative by which we understand the world, but also our liturgies, our formative practices, our acting out of that narrative, our sacraments. And also, they will dictate our symbols, the means by which we communicate meaning. And finally, our communities, the stage upon which we act this thing out. In other words, the kind of change that this level of technology brings is, in Neil Postman's words, ecological. He uses an environmental metaphor, essentially meaning that, one significant change in an ecosystem, like removing all the predators, doesn't leave you with the same system minus the predators, right? It gives you an entirely new system. The questions to ask, then, of a new technology are not the practical questions. Not questions like, will this help us spread the gospel? Or, will this increase our attendance? Or how do we go about sharing the gospel in the metaverse? That's the most important question. It isn't. We have to actually go to the meta level, or we will be deceived. We need to know in what way this technological artifact is going to alter our conception of reality. In what way will it change concepts like God, the church, worship, etc.? Because it will change the meanings of words, as we said. That's part of the project, to change the symbols. It's a necessary part. As Plato predicted in his case, concerning the changing of the concepts of memory and wisdom, or knowledge. Memory will become mere recollection. Wisdom, indistinguishable from information. A similar danger is present in our case. Take, just as an example, the technology of digital conferencing software. Right? A seemingly innocuous innovation. Zoom, as we call it. Right? Zoom, however, is not just changing the meaning of words like meeting. What do we mean by meeting? Before it meant that we'd be in person. No longer. It's not just changing that word, but it's changing the word church and the word worship. Definitions which have been fixed for 2,000 years, changed in a matter of months. The word church, for example, in the Greek is ekklesia, and it means the assembly of God. That word has taken on a whole new meaning in the digital age. An assembly which doesn't actually assemble, or assembles only digitally, or in the future, virtually we assemble. Is that really an assembly? Or consider how the notion of intelligence is changing in the wake of AI, of artificial intelligence. The computational capacity of these machines is far beyond what we can even comprehend. A technology which, in my estimation, will not lead to an improvement in our thinking, but a removal of the need of it at all, just as the written word removed the need for our memory, which would free us from the burden of thinking so that we can spend our days in what our heart's desire really is, it seems, never-ending amusement. The machines can do all the thinking for us and run the world for us. All of this is just a small part of the huge cultural shift we are currently experiencing with the invention of digital technology. We are living in that gray zone, the gray area between eras, as Plato was. And the COVID-19 pandemic has been a great accelerator of this transformation, much of which, as I've said, we must push back against. Now, one of the loftier promises made by these new social media platforms is that the virtual environments they create will result in thriving communities. That they will provide us, through increased connectivity, that essential sense of belonging that each of us longs for. Now, I was going to show you a promo of the metaverse so that you could experience the pitch, this appeal to community. But even though it was a mass media campaign ad, it's on the splash page of their website, it wasn't appropriate for children, not even close. So if you think everything I say here is wrong and that technology is neutral, go watch the ads and judge for yourself. But what I want to do is consider that claim of greater community through greater connectivity by way of analogy through another technology which made somewhat similar promises, the automobile, which promised us not only greater mobility, but greater connectivity, right? The ability to traverse great distances quickly so that we could visit family and friends and that we could meet new people, people we would never have had a chance to meet before this great innovation. A kind of connectivity that it certainly delivered, but at what cost is the question. What was lost in obtaining this greater connectivity, and did that connectivity lead to greater community? Far from being simply a tool for getting us from point A to point B, the automobile radically altered our built environment, the environment that we construct. Before World War II and the complete proliferation of cars, the zoning in towns and cities was mixed between commercial and residential, meaning that houses typically surrounded the businesses of the town square. Georgetown, of course, downtown Georgetown being a perfect example of a pre-World War II community. And most people walked to where they needed to go, to school, to the store, to the bank, to the church, to the hospital. Right? Old Georgetown Hospital is just a down university. I can walk to it from my house. It's 4 or 5 blocks. Indeed, almost everything that you needed back then was within walking distance. But since World War II, walkable neighborhoods, as they were called, were no longer built. Rather, communities were structured around roads to accommodate our vehicles. And this shift eventually led to zoning laws which separated residential areas from commercial ones. And houses were moved to more secluded areas outside of the city limits, miles away from shopping and schools and church, etc., which made walking to such places almost impossible. And at the same time, commercial areas became more and more unwalkable, as we might say, with wider streets and heavier traffic and no sidewalks, all because of the capability of automobiles. To show you how different this is, I know a preacher who's Zimbabwean. He's from Zimbabwe. His name's Nelson. And the first time he came to America, those who were sponsoring him put him up in a hotel which was located in a busy commercial area. But of course, Nelson, coming from Zimbabwe, is used to walking places. That's how he gets where he's going to go. And so he decided to leave the hotel and go on a walkabout to see what it is around him that he could see. Well, he couldn't get more than 50 feet without someone stopping and pulling over and asking him, did his car break down, or can they give him a lift, or what's happened that you are walking? And this just perplexed him. Right? He asked me, don't Americans walk? Do you not walk anywhere? And I essentially said, no, we don't walk. We drive. It never occurred to me up to that moment, but almost everywhere we go, we drive, even if it's 5 blocks. The only time we do walk is not to go somewhere, but for exercise, right? Which cars have now made necessary for us to have something that we call exercise, right? Which tells us a principle, by the way. Natural limitations provide us benefits that when those limitations are removed because of technology, must then be replaced with intentional practices, or we lose the benefit entirely, like the benefit of exercise. So what besides exercise has been lost, or the need for that exercise? What else has been lost by this radical change? Well, Jane Jacobs, in her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, tries to poetically capture the value of pedestrian-oriented towns under a section that she titles "The Ballet of the Street." She writes, "When I get home after work, the ballet is reaching its crescendo. This is the time of roller skates and stilts and tricycles and games in the lee of the stoop with bottle caps and plastic cowboys. This is the time of bundles and packages, zigzagging from the drugstore to the fruit stand and back over to the butcher's. This is the time when teenagers, all dressed up, are pausing to ask if their slips show or their collars look right. This is the time when beautiful girls get out of MGs. This is the time when the fire engines go through. This is the time when anybody you know around Hudson Street will go by." Now, some of you will recognize this scene from your childhood. I do to some extent. But for others, you will have never known this reality. Writer Eric Jacobson recognizes in Jacob's vision here a picture of the biblical notion of shalom in all of its metaphysical breadth and depth. The notion of flourishing that constitutes a peace with God, with man, and with the world. Jacobson quotes the prophet Zechariah in support of this, Zechariah 8:4-5. "This is what the Lord Almighty says. Once again, men and women of ripe old age will sit in the streets of Jerusalem, each of them with cane in hand because of their age. The city streets will be filled with boys and girls playing there." This is a picture of a return to an idyllic city life, of a flourishing community, the diversity, the density, and dynamism that we discussed last week. But technology has removed the natural forces which create such communities, the forced proximity which breathes life into them, a closeness that we today likely assume would lead to greater hostility, but which is actually essential for peace. And thus we've exchanged the thriving community life for the solitary confinement of the cul-de-sac, all for the sake of greater connectivity. And the solution for this kind of escapism is not virtual communities. It's not more escapism, because that will only increase our isolation. Which takes us to a second principle, which is that technology, when it is flourishing under the meta-narrative of technicism, or the sort of technology as a religion, has an amazing ability to self-perpetuate, right? Because technology is created, it does one particular thing that's good, but it causes all these other problems, which then means another technology has to be created and solve those problems, and it creates another set of problems and another. It's self-perpetuating. It goes on forever. We should not be trying to solve this problem that was created by technology with more technology. In fact, what we need to do is to sacrifice connectivity for community, and even convenience for community, to choose community over convenience. We might say to those who have given birth to this technology that what you've created is an elixir not for community, but for connectivity, for convenience. And we don't want it. And so what I'm suggesting is that, at least in a number of areas, is that we need to return to the old path, to intentionally building in-person communities, right? Because, as I said, the natural forces are no longer there, they've been removed, and so now we have to become very intentional in the building of these communities. And I say in-person communities, right? A phrase which would have been redundant not that long ago, but now it has to be clarified. Why? Because the idea of community has been redefined. We can have a community when we're actually, not together, other than through some sort of virtual way or digital way. And this is not only true for our towns, but our homes. Under the guise of connectivity, we are losing the family. The modern household is characterized by everyone being buried in their individual device. where I have 1,000 followers on TikTok, but I haven't had a substantive conversation with my parents in 6 weeks. And therefore we need to restore things, intentionally restore things like family dinners. And by family dinners, I mean in-person dinners. Because it won't be long before the dining room will become a relic, a thing of the dated past, deleted from new floor plans, because why waste the space for an activity which has become obsolete? Maybe it'll be replaced by a VR, by a virtual reality room. But more and more we eat in isolation because we can. And we don't realize the massive consequences of the loss of communal meals, of everything that is accomplished at the dinner table. This is the changing of our liturgies. The natural limitations have been removed. And so what we have to do now for these essential practices is we have to become intentional in reviving them and in sustaining them. That's a big part of our pushback. Now, don't mistake what I'm saying. I'm not a Luddite. I don't assume that technology will inevitably lead to a dystopian future. The point I'm making is that sweeping technological change brings sweeping cultural change. That technology is not neutral, and that those who are most responsible for creating it at the moment do not share our vision of the good life. Thus, with any new technology, we have to go into it with our eyes wide open, aware of the pros and the cons, not naively, as the fool does. The truth is, wise men are never ecstatic about dramatic technological change because they understand its dual nature. Be wary of anyone who only promotes the benefits of a new technology. Be wary of the one who has created that technology when they tell you, right, what the pros and the cons are. As Plato says, no, you're too close to this, right? You've given birth to it, it's your child. You're not the one who is to assess what the pros and cons are. Someone else must do that. Which is to say that technology must be negotiated with, and a balance must always be struck. And so a healthy skepticism is called for, and the discernment of the Spirit, most importantly, the wisdom of God, so that we would be wise as serpents and innocent as doves, not the other way around. So the question then left is to say, okay, those who create this technology are not the ones to judge it. Who then is left to judge it? Right? Are our politicians the ones who are to make this kind of meta-analysis and decide whether the technology is good or not? Who should be speaking in this very at this meta level? Who is it that's to do it? Well, it's the church. That's who's supposed to do it, ultimately. The church is supposed to guide the world when it comes to these meta issues, of meta narratives, right? Of ultimate purpose and meaning, what it means to be a human being, and who God is, and who the church is, and what the future ultimately holds. It's the church. And so this is part of our responsibility. Not only to speak against it, but to push back against it through our practices. To be intentional in reviving those practices which are essential to community. I mean, one positive in all of this is if this comes about and people spend most of their time in this virtual world, and we're meeting in a building with real people, we will separate ourselves, right? Our narrative, our hope, our life, everything will become dramatically different than theirs. And so it will be a real dividing of the worldviews, a clarifying of them, and that clarity in the coming days will be needed. I thank you for your kind attention.